Ubercharge is important. It is so important, in fact, that you'll probably, if you've seen any of my other videos, have heard me say at some point that Uber is the centralizing mechanic of TF2. Essentially, the state of Ubercharge, as in one medic's Uber relative to the other, is going to inform basically every decision you make in the game, as far as who you shoot at, what you're doing, and even where you're positioned. Let's think of just one example off the dome here. So as a demo, whether I am setting up a trap or not, whether I'm holding S or W, and whether I'm trying to spam a doorway or not, or pressure that doorway, really comes down to the state of Ubers. If it's Uber disadvantage, then I'm expecting the other team to push, and I might be setting traps in order to try and get a kill during that push. But on the flip side, if my team has Uber advantage, then I would just be wasting my time setting up traps, because it's in fact my team that wants to take space, not concede it. So when it comes to Ubers, they're very important, and the stages of an Uber, particularly, and this is, I'm going to be talking about ad Ubers here, as in you're using an Uber when the other team does not have one, and how to make that as effective as possible. As far as the stages of an Uber and how important they are, I honestly think that the most important part of an Uber is in fact the post Uber. It's where you're positioned and what you're doing as a team when you're no longer invincible. Because it's very, very, very easy as a team to get a little in too deep, a little in over your head when you are glowing and invincible. And then when that's no longer the case, you are at your most vulnerable, right? Because you oftentimes are the closest to the other team. You're often the deepest into enemy territory. Oh man, that was almost a feed. And yeah, you're very vulnerable as a result. So post Ubers take the cake for the most important for me. The Uber itself, of course, is very important because that's when you're invincible. You want to be taking advantage of your invincibility as much as you can. And then arguably the least important is what happens before the Uber, leading up to the Uber. Because a lot of the time you're really just looking to get through a door cleanly. But that being said, the topic of today's video is in fact that least important, quote unquote, aspect of the Uber, what leads up to it. Because while, yes, the post Uber and the Uber itself are really, really important and get talked about a lot, I think that what happens before the Uber is oftentimes a little understated, even though, despite, not necessarily being as impactful as your post Uber or something to that effect, it's still going to be impactful and still worth being good at, right? So I want to talk about what happens before the Uber, how to make that more effective, and basically get off onto the right foot with your Ubers. Because getting through a door cleanly and actually being able to Uber into the other team is going to set yourself up for a successful Uber. You're going to be able to get more kills when you're in a position to do so, for example. So yeah, we'll see if there's enough there to talk about, and where to start. Well, I think that we'll probably start with pacing first, because it is really important how you pace your Ubers in order to make sure you're getting the most out of your ad. And this is a example I bring up very often, and it involves a lot of numbers and it's confusing every single time, but I'm going to try my best here. But essentially, oh, that's brutal. So in effect, your Uber advantage only ever dwindles when you get Uber. Why is that? So if you have, let's say 40% Uber advantage, so you have 40% Uber when the other team's medic spawns. If you assume that your medic and the other team's medic build Uber at roughly the same rate, then when you're at 80%, that 40% advantage means they'd be at 40%, right? And then suddenly, when you're at 100%, they'd be at 60. But once you hit 100, you're not going higher than that. So at that point, that Uber advantage goes from 40. Okay, they build from 60 to 70, and now it's 30 advantage, suddenly down to 20, 10, and then it's even Ubers. So only when you hit 100% does that ad start to dwindle, meaning in the context of pushing with your Uber, when you are using as you're getting and pushing as you're getting, sorry if I bumped the mic there, that's, at your maximum potential. If it's 30 ad, you can't really grow that ad unless the other team's just bad at building, which relies on them messing up, which sure you can take advantage of if you can recognize it, but not something you should be relying on from game to game. But your ad will certainly go down if you're really slow with it. If you have 30 ad into last, that ad is really only effective if you are using it as you're getting. Because if you wait until you're at 100% to, for example, enter lobby, which is a prerequisite for pushing, then by the time you're actually set up for the push is probably another 15% later for the other team. They're probably already at, nearly 90%. And by the time you get towards the med, he's going to be at 95. And by the time the other team kites your Uber, they're going to have. And suddenly your advantage is completely gone. And in fact, depending on when your Uber runs out, it might be a pretty big disadvantage because you might just be stuck really deep in enemy territory. And now the tables have turned. They have an Ubercharge and you don't. So yeah, number one for that pre-Uber and the stages leading up to an Uber that's really, really important is actually pacing things correctly. Understand that you want to be in a position to if you're just planning to pop through, right? You want to be in a position to use that Uber as you're getting, in order to have as large of ad as is allowed by the game state. And you don't want to let Ubers dwindle by the time you actually use it, if you know you want to use it anyway. Great example on screen actually right now. We are at 80% already going dungeon because we know when we want to use. Look at that, 99, 100. We're already walking through the door. My bomb is really bad. So, and our flank just dies. So it's not going to be a success at all. But still, the pacing there was not the problem at all. Right. So pacing definitely important. I've talked about this before, so it's not going to be new territory for some of you. But what next? The next thing is the actual communication aspect of Uber, which is really, really important because I've seen so many times a team just be so uncoordinated for the start of an Uber and players get dropped and by get dropped, I mean they are not flashed with the Uber or the Uber isn't even used at all on them as they're running in, expecting to be invincible, and then they just die. Things like that. Just horrible things happening only through a lack of communication, and particularly a lack of preemptive communication, where if you're looking to take an Uber, you can't just expect to call a use from your med and have it instantly happen. And almost all the time that I'm trying to take an Uber, I'm calling that I'm trying to probably take an Uber, right? Or at the very least, in an example where I might not want to use outright, but if the other team's caught, I do. So in this case, we are dry pushing. We have Uber advantage. We have the Uber, the other team doesn't. But we're trying to just take the point without using. And so, oh man, we did successfully take second without using there. But if the other team were really forward and caught to our Uber, then I would want to use the Uber and kill them all. Very straightforward idea there. But we don't really know if that's the situation or not. And our med is certainly not going to know, because you don't want your med to be the furthest one forward, because they're vulnerable to spam and things like that. You don't want to have your med get forced just because they want a spot. So you need to sort of preempt stuff like that with communication. So let's try to dry push. We'll see if they're caught or something like that. And then the big thing is if a player wants to get an Uber used on them, just call on me. It is the easiest call in the world to make. Basically, every single Uber that I take that I want the Uber to be popped on me, I'm calling that. So even if we know we want to use through a doorway, and there's no ambiguity about that whatsoever, when we're about to use through that doorway, I'm calling on me. Because even though we know we want to use through, maybe my soldier is getting a final crit buff before we take the Uber, and my med isn't on me. I, as the demo, don't want to be bombing in without Uber, nor would I, as a pocket scout, want to be walking into a trap without Uber, for example. So when you're that player that the Uber is, and I know, oh man, that is a fantastic example of why you want to call on me, which I probably did here, but it, again, communication issues. This Uber wound up fine, but, and for those of you who might not be watching but only listening, I ended up just double sticky bombing in without Uber on me because, again, that miscommunication where a player's trying to go in and not actually Ubered. And it is important to take those Ubers quickly, right? Because if you particularly telegraph exactly what door you're going or something to that effect, then it becomes much easier for the other team to kite, and it's a lot harder to actually catch kills with the Uber. This is particularly true into last, where a lot of teams will just kite through spawn. If you telegraph what door you're going, then you're basically giving the other team like a half a second worth of free kiting time, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in TF2 is absolutely a lot. Especially if, like, as a demo, you might only shoot 2-3 shots by the time they're gone. If that turns into only one shot, then you're not going to get enough damage out to kill anyone. So yeah, taking those Ubers fast is really important. And that's why being able to communicate well and coordinate that is really, really relevant, because it enables you to take those things quickly because you are preempting what needs to happen so that when you're ready to actually use the Uber, it's more seamless. So calls like that, calls like on me, things like that. And of course, if you're a med and someone's trying to take an Uber and you can't because you're not with them, then by all means, they should be knowing that, and it should be called off essentially. I don't know why I'm not involved in this Uber. That's weird. This is some inspired stuff. We got 2 kills though, so it's going quite well. Yeah, this is definitely a round. Right. So the communication aspect, very, very important as far as leading into an Uber. And next I want to talk about how to, like, literally take an Uber through a doorway, because getting through cleanly is really important. And this, honestly, so the sort of rule of thumb that I would teach people for a long time, which I still think is mostly true, is that for open doorways, as in a doorway that is not a shutter, it's a good idea to lead your demo. And the reason for that being, your demo can just insta-bomb from the corner, and your demo bomb is usually what catches players in the doorway itself. So the faster that is, the harder it is for the other team to react and kite. So if they see the scout round the corner first and then the demo gets flashed and bombs, you're giving the other team some time to kite, and you're making your demo bomb less successful as a result. Now, some people would definitely disagree with this. Some teams do like to lead scout, like always. But from my experience, generally speaking, in those non-shutter doorways, I like to lead the Uber as a demo for that reason. Now, this isn't always true. So in cases where I just know that a gun is going to juggle me, then it's not even worth it, right? And honestly, something I've seen invite players this past season be really good at is bombing high such that the gun doesn't deny them, because remember, sentry guns not only have to lock on side to side, but up and down as well. And you can effectively avoid some of that, the most necessary or most important and earliest knockback by going sort of above it. So it takes time tracking, and yeah. But that's not always the case. Some doors, there's just going to be a gun that's going to juggle you. And in those cases, leading demo really doesn't help. And in fact, it might be worth leading your scout so that they absorb the gun knockback and your demo can bomb from behind. Again, play it by ear. And in some cases, I don't even like bombing at all as a demo. I can think of 2 specific Ubers for which this is the case. So big one being, we're about to take an Uber here. Let's actually see how this goes. So we're buffing everyone up. That is something I should definitely talk about. Soldiers in the door. That's just unfortunate. Get the gun. So this is actually like during Uber things. The actual start of our Uber there were some decent things going on. The soldier just body blocked me in the door and we didn't get the kill on him, which to be honest is just unlucky. Oh well. Anyway, what was I talking about? Right. Certain pushes, bombing just might not even be worth it at all. So for example, on process last, if there's a gun on the right side and you want to take an Uber through 4 to immediately kill the gun, that's something I'll just waddle through the door to do, for example. But most of the time, in those open doors, I like bombing first as a demo. Right, now what about shutters that are not those open doors? Well, in those cases, I think leading scout is generally good wisdom. And the big reason for that is that shutters can be trapped. And when shutters are trapped, of course, you should always be using, and that we'll put a pin in the buffing players and we'll put a pin in like when to actually literally use, because those are both actually pretty important. Right, so you shouldn't be milking through shutters pretty much ever, unless you know the other team doesn't have a demo and you know they don't have a sniper, for example, which can be the case. But yeah, most of the time you're going to be popping through those shutters. But if it's trapped, even if everyone is invincible that's within range of that trap, still that trap being dead and knocking those players back can really stunt on Uber. And on certain common shutters to Uber through, such as Gully Wash or particularly Snakewater, this can be a real issue. And you don't want your scout getting shot all the way back to the moon just because they peeked the shutter and it got dead, right? So your demo is uniquely equipped to help deal with that by pre-placing a sticky on your side of the shutter so that when your scout peeks, your demo can det and knock away any would-be traps. And then from behind your scout, your demo gets to bomb. So in those shutter examples, having your demo actually clear the sticks and the scout bomb, or the scout lead the Uber, I find to generally be more successful. Again, I'm trying to think if there's any exceptions to that rule, like in the other case. And honestly, no. Basically every shutter I like leading scout for that reason, just because it's a much better setup to deal with traps juggling your Uber. Right. And also, like, if there's a weird pyro on Gully Wash playing close shutter, then your scout's just going to be better dealing with that, for example. But anyway. So yes. The actual order of who's getting popped through on the doors, there is a lot of thought that can go into that, and it might change point to point and team to team as well with what you prefer to do. So anyway, that's probably it for that. So let's pick up one of those pins we left off earlier and talk about buffing players, because buffing players is going to be a luxury and a really, really helpful one at that. So a soldier that has 300 HP when your Uber is getting popped is going to be way, way more effective than one who's at 200. And in some cases, your soldier might be like subsisting off a pack. You're trying to take like a quick Uber and they're only like 170 or something, which can be rough. And if they get shoved, for example, then that buff is the difference between them just getting a kill versus getting a trade. And if they're weak, that might just be a death, in fact, with no kill in return, which is obviously bad. So players who are healthy are going to be much more successful at pushing last. This is, pretty straightforward and uncontroversial, but you don't always have the luxury of buffing players. It really is just a matter of time and understanding where your Uber margins lie. And again, when you pace things well, you're going to be able to buff players in more positions. If you're entering lobby at 80%, for example, then you're more likely to be able to buff a player on the way versus if you're entering the lobby after already getting Uber, then you really can't afford to buff anyone. Otherwise, it'll just even out completely. So especially in those Ubers where it's a lot of ad, those are the positions where it's a really good idea to get all those players buffs. Now, of course, crit heals are going to play a huge role in this, specifically for your soldiers. So if players are just eating damage for no reason, then they might be depriving themselves of buffs. But yeah, understanding those margins, if it's slimmer ad, then you really can't afford to be giving those buffs out so readily. That's unfortunate. Is this demo really over? We're going to have to load some randomness. It might be trash or not. As you can see, I have not been playing a ton of TF2 lately. This is 60 megabytes, so there's probably something here. Right. Yeah, it really does just come down to those margins. Oh, we're still in sunshine. Yes. What else? Right, the other pin we were talking about was... Talked about buffing players, and we talked about... Oh shoot, what was it? Because we talked about the actual order. Right, when to actually use. Because it is not... Yeah, to milk or not to milk, basically. So there's a few things at play here. Number one is if you're planning to use anyway, and this is something that I see a lot of teams do, and sometimes I don't even know if they realize the risks they're taking, but shaving off an extra quarter of a second of an Uber, actually quarter of a second, maybe that's an accurate prescription, at the risk of dying to and dropping to a trap and dropping players to a trap is just not worth it. And there are so many very standard Ubers for which this is a common occurrence. Two big examples come to mind. So in Gully Wash, if you are going to Uber through Shutter, you have to get through Lockers first. And Lockers is a teeny tiny room that takes no time to walk through. And it's very commonly trapped as well. So some teams will run through Lockers, milk through Lockers, not take time to clear a trap or anything, because to be honest, I don't think the Lockers trap is even worth clearing if you're just going to take an Uber through Shutter. They'll walk through this teeny tiny door only to end up using their Uber anyway on Shutter. And if they had simply just popped through Lockers and just walked through Shutter, then you run zero risk whatsoever of players getting dropped to a trap in Lockers, and the actual length of your Uber is not that meaningfully changed. Especially in a map like Gully Wash, where you basically want every Uber you take to end top right, which is just right there when you walk out of Shutter, so you're not losing almost anything at all. Another very classic example is Metalworks. So left lobby, that kind of elbow, is a very common door for players to take Uber, teams to take Ubers through. And again, it is a tiny little, the call out is elbow, because it's just a tiny little piece of the map that connects lobby towards last through a tiny connector that again takes like a fraction of a second to walk through. And again, it's something that demos will trap. And again, something that teams will try to either take the time to clear traps for no reason, only to pop through the door anyway, or they will risk dropping to the trap in that door only to use through the next one. And it just makes no sense not to just use earlier, so that you actually get to have a well-paced Uber. You're not slowing down, you're not running any unnecessary risks, and yeah, it's just far superior. There's probably other examples, but if you're going to be using through the door anyway, then really, really consider, what map you're on and what point you're on, and whether you're just risking a trap for no reason, just to save a fraction of a second of the Uber, right? Because most of the time it's just not worth it. And also, I see a lot of teams that will milk Uber. Well, we'll just talk about milking in general rather than make a specific point. So milking into last can be a very powerful plan, because you can get really deep into the other team's last and really deep into the point without having to use, right? Which is a pretty strong advantage to have. Now, that being said, let's see. this Uber, in fact. Okay. I mean, the start of the Uber was probably fine, which is the thing we're focusing on here. I thought the NG was still with the gun, but unfortunately it was not. Anyway, this Uber's actually not looking, the post Uber's not looking horrible. Oh, it's in fact looking kind of nice, but they might be close to getting, which is kind of what's, yeah, they're moving like they had, which they did. Anyway, that distraction aside, right, so milking can be nice, and on points that aren't the last point, you can just straight up milk for the entire point. You're not going to be able to cap last without using, in all likelihood, if the other team, have their monitors turned on. But you can apply a lot of pressure and take a lot of space without needing to use your Uber. But there are definitely some downsides to this, and I see teams milk in situations where it doesn't make sense, and sometimes I see teams milk and end up hurting themselves by doing so. And what do I mean by this? Well, for starters, milking on slim ad margins is basically a recipe for Uber's evening out. If you're trying to milk into last with 30 ad or less, then just know you're doing something that's very slow. So you're giving the other team a lot of time to get Uber, which can be a valid plan if you're choosing to just get space and treat it like a sack, like you would in even Ubers, but just with really, really good pressure. And that can totally work, but understand that's the plan you're doing. If you want to actually play the advantage, then choosing to milk through a door is just shooting yourself in the foot, and you should try to be going fast, in fact, because that's when your Uber ad is the largest, and you're less likely to get immediately used back in on. So there's that to consider. And another thing as well is, and this is more of an issue with less experienced players. It's going to be something that stronger players are going to be much better at. But a lot of the time as well, I do see teams that will milk through successfully. They take space, but the other team kites to their other side. They actually have like some positioning from which to fight the point. So at this point, and this is again, but this is a situation in which it's plenty of ad. You're not worried about things evening out. So the other team kites, you're space taking, and now you're just on a side on last, and it's like a now what kind of moment, right? And sometimes you just kind of use the Uber just because you want to right click. It seems like the right thing to do, and then you just don't really have a springboard. You don't have an idea of what you're doing. Maybe some players took damage because the pacing is a little off from what you're used to with a more standard fast Uber through the door. And it just doesn't materialize into anything because there doesn't seem to be a plan, right? And in those cases, it's really important to still understand the pacing of the Uber itself, right? You want to actually, be playing your positioning. You want players to be playing their health because, again, as I said in the start of the video, the Uber itself and the post Uber are really, really important, and you want to be playing more for those. But if you can successfully milk through a door, you want it to actually advantage you. You want it to be because you can then be popping through from one side of the last into the other and just completely annihilate the other team, for example. Right. That might be, those were the 2 pins I had, and nothing else came to mind. So we might be done talking about the start of the Uber, because it really is important. If I were to generalize everything into one sort of coherent thought here, the start of the Uber is important insofar as it gets to set you up for a successful Uber. And that takes a lot of consideration because your primary means of scoring rounds and your primary means of generating momentum from one point into further points, in the case of you not Ubering into last, for example, is generated from Ubers and the kills you get during Ubers, the kills you get in those post Ubers, and all of that starts with the conditions of the game state on which you're actually popping. So being able to take an Uber really quickly and really decisively is going to make them far more successful. And to do that is going to require communication. It's going to require a clear order of events and a clear intention with which that start of your Uber just gets you off on the right foot and catches the other team off guard. That was a surprisingly elegant way to put it for all the rambling I just did for the past, I would guess, 20 minutes. So anyway, that's all I have to talk about that topic. The often understated, but nonetheless important aspect of the start of those Ubercharges. Right, so hope you all enjoyed. Hopefully you learned something. And yeah, I'll see you all next time.